Next, a professor and former government official who has been on a decades-long quest to combat inequality. Now he's become the focus of a new film. NewsHour economics correspondent Paul Solomon has our look. It's part of his ongoing reporting, Making Sense of Financial News.
My name is Robert Reich. I was Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. Before that, the Carter administration. Before that, I was a special aide to Abraham Lincoln.
The improbable star of an unlikely feature film. The chart and graph filled, often funny, sometimes sad documentary, Inequality for All.
Robert Reich, welcome.
Thank you.
What's the basic argument here?
The argument is that inequality is bad for everyone, not just the middle class and the poor. 95% of the gains, the economic gains, since the recovery began in 2009, are going to the top 1%. Meanwhile, the median household income keeps dropping, adjusted for inflation. Well, where are people going to get the money they need to keep the economy going?
I first met you in the early 1980s, and you were already beginning to talk about this phenomenon of inequality, right?
I am so boring, Paul. I mean, I bore myself. And in this movie, I see myself talking about the same issue, and I'm in my early 30s, and I'm in my 40s, and I'm in my 50s. And it's, you know, if you ever want to get a sense of your own personal failure, look at yourself trying to get across a point that nobody is listening to, and the situation gets worse and worse.
In the film, Reich reveals a very personal reason for his persistence.
When I was a kid, the bigger boys would pick on me. Yeah, that was what you did. That's what is done. So I got an idea that I would make alliances with older boys. You know, like just one or two who would be my protectors. The summer when I was about 10, one of the older boys who I depended on to kind of be a protector, his name was Michael Schwerner. In the summer of '64, I learned that Mickey had been in Mississippi registering voters. And he and two other people who had been with him registering voters were tortured and murdered. I think something just kind of shifted in my brain. I thought, I have to make sure that in whatever way I can, that people have some degree of protection. My life. The vulnerable people, protect people from which there are many. The people who would don't up and can suffer the economic bullies. We're the richest economy in the history of the world. For the majority of Americans not to get the benefits of this extraordinarily prosperous economy, there's something fundamentally wrong.
The early 1980s was when the growing divide first emerged. The early signs of the rich getting richer, while almost everyone else was falling behind.
Is it not plausible that what's happening is that we're living in a more and more skills-intensive world economy, and that some people, perhaps because of who their parents married and their natural endowments and certainly their cultural environment, just have more of those skills than everybody else, and they're getting rewarded for it?
Well, undoubtedly that's part of the story, but we also know that we have less upward mobility than any other advanced country.
So you mean natural endowments can't explain it all?
Natural endowments don't explain it all, can't explain it all. We have a school system that is not very good, particularly for poor and working class and middle class kids. We also know that it's getting harder and harder to finance higher education. I think it's wrong to be an economic determinist. I think it's wrong to simply say, well, inevitably, if you're poor, you're going to get a lousy education. If you're lower middle class, the cards are going to be stacked against you. You'll probably never get anywhere.
But a lot of people think, particularly the people who have benefited, that they're entitled to the fruits of their abilities, their labor.
What do you expect them to say? Some of them, like Warren Buffett, and Nick Hanauer, who's in the film, say, I should be taxed more, this is crazy. But many of them say, if I'm wealthy, I must be really smart.
I want a shot for people like me to grow up and do something with themselves.
Like Reich, director Jacob Kornbluth has personal reasons for his focus on inequality.
I grew up poor. My mother raised a family of 4 on between $9,000 and $15,000 a year. I'm 40 years old. What I've seen my whole life is widening income inequality. But so what? So the economy has grown so unequal. Why should we care? Why should we care? That's the subject of the movie. That's why we made it.
Who is actually looking out for the American worker? The answer is nobody. We are losing equal opportunity in America. Any one of you who feels cynical, just consider where we have been.
Why do you care so much?
Because equal opportunity is what this country is built on. If so many people feel like the game is rigged, Paul, that they're sort of giving up on politics. You know, they
No,
say
for sure.
They're totally cynical. Well, if you give up on politics, you're giving up on democracy. And if you give up on democracy, you're basically saying to the moneyed interests, the powerful people and institutions of society, take it all. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then we give up. Then we are 100% plutocracy.
Robert Reich, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Some politicians are calling for higher taxes on the rich. And naturally, these proposals have unleashed a torrent of opposition, mostly from the rich. Here are the 12 biggest myths they are propounding. Myth. A top marginal tax rate applies to all of a person's total income or wealth.
Why aren't you giving 70% of your income to the government? You could.
You're going to tax 70% of your paycheck.
Wrong. It would only apply to dollars in excess of a certain level. The 70% income tax rate proposed by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would apply only to dollars in excess of $10 million a year. The 2% wealth tax proposed by Elizabeth Warren would apply only to wealth in excess of $50 million. Myth. Raising taxes on the rich is a far-left idea.
She wants to radically tax the rich.
Taxing rich people, that's an old saw from the left.
Baloney. 70% of Americans, including 54% of Republicans, support raising taxes on families making more than $10 million a year. And expecting the rich to pay their fair share is a traditional American idea. From 1930 to 1980, the average top marginal income tax rate was 78%. From 1951 to 1963, it exceeded 90%. Again, only on dollars in excess of a very high threshold. Even considering all deductions and tax credits, the very rich paid over half of their top incomes in taxes. Myth. A wealth tax is unconstitutional.
Bad idea.
And it's likely unconstitutional.
Sounds great. Not constitutional, I don't think.
Rubbish. Most locales already impose an annual wealth tax on the value of people's homes, the main source of household wealth for most people. It's called the property tax. The rich hold most of their wealth in stocks and bonds. So why should these forms of wealth escape taxation? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes. Myth. When taxes on the rich are cut, they invest more and everyone benefits. When taxes on the rich are increased, economic growth slows.
The frightening thing about high marginal tax rates is that it leads us into a low productivity economy.
They're going to stop creating jobs. If you raise the interest rates, they'll stop investing money, they'll stop borrowing money, and that has a trickle-down effect.
Utter baloney. Trickle-down economics is a cruel joke. Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan all cut taxes on the rich, and nothing trickled down. There's no evidence that higher taxes on the rich slows economic growth. To the contrary, when the top marginal tax rate has been high, between 71 and 92%, growth has averaged 4% a year. But when the top rate has been low, between 28 and 39%, growth has averaged only 2.1%. Myth. When you cut taxes on corporations, they invest more and create more jobs.
Will stimulate investment domestically, stimulate the jobs that the economy needs.
Wrong again. After Trump and the Republicans lowered the corporate tax rate in 2018, America's largest corporations cut more jobs than they created. They used their tax savings largely to increase their stock prices by buying back their own shares of stock, enriching executives and wealthy investors, but providing no real benefit to the economy. Myth. The rich already pay more than their fair share in taxes.
When she says the thing about fair share, you know the top 1% of earners pay 40% of income taxes.
The top 1% already pay 37% of all federal income taxes.
This is misleading because it focuses only on income taxes, leaving out the large and growing tax burden on lower income Americans. Payroll taxes, state and local sales taxes, and property taxes take bigger bites out of the pay of lower income families than higher income. Myth. The rich already pay capital gains taxes.
The very, very top pay capital gains tax.
We already have a 30%, 20 to 30% tax on capital gains.
Misleading. Rich families avoid paying capital gains taxes by passing their wealth on to their heirs. In fact, the largest share of big estates transferred from generation to generation are unrealized capital gains that have never been taxed. Myth. The estate tax is a death tax that hits millions of Americans.
Does death trigger another grab from the government? It's so un-American, it just turns my stomach. She wants another bite at the apple. And when you die, even another bite at the apple, 40% worth.
Baloney. The current estate tax, which only applies to assets in excess of $11 million or $22 million for couples, affects fewer than 2,000 families. Myth. If taxes are raised on the wealthy, they will find ways to evade them, so very little money is going to be raised.
Billionaires will go somewhere else, multimillionaires will go somewhere else.
So you raise these taxes and people shift their investments to avoid higher taxes.
More rubbish. For example, a 2% wealth tax, as proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren, would raise around $2.75 trillion over the next decade, with very little tax evasion, according to research. A 70% tax on incomes over $10 million would raise close to $720 billion over the next 10 years. Myth. The only reason to raise taxes on the wealthy is to collect revenue.
No one really believes that it would either bring in more revenues. It's not just because you object to the existence of rich people. You're not trying to hurt them. You just want to pay for more stuff.
No. Although these proposals would generate lots of revenue and help us reduce the national debts while investing in schools, roads, and all the other things we need, another major purpose is to reduce inequality and thereby safeguard democracy against oligarchy. Myth. It's unfair to raise taxes on the wealthy.
Seems to me like it's more a debate about punishing the rich, about punishing success.
The most successful are not only paying their fair share, they're paying the most. Pay your fair share? What are you talking about?
Actually, it's unfair not to raise taxes on the rich. For the last 40 years, most Americans have seen almost no growth in their incomes at all, while the incomes of a minority at the top have skyrocketed. We're rapidly heading toward a society dominated by a handful of super rich, many of whom have never worked a day in their lives. More than 60% of wealth in America is now inherited. Myth. They earned it. It's their money.
I think if people earn money, they should be able to hold on to it.
And be able to do as they see fit with their newfound hard-earned cash.
Hogwash. It's their country, too. They couldn't maintain their fortunes without what America provides: national defense, police, laws, courts, political stability, and the Constitution. They couldn't have got where they are without other things America provides: education, infrastructure, and a nation that respects private property. And to argue it's their money also ignores a lot of other ways America has bestowed advantages on the rich. Everything from bailing out Wall Street bankers when they get into trouble to subsidizing the research of big pharma. So the next time you hear one of these myths, know the truth. Trump voters. 2 years in, here's an updated list of Trump's 30 biggest broken promises. Number 1, he told you he'd cut your taxes and that the super rich like him would pay more.
I think there's very little benefit for people of wealth.
You bought it. But his 2017 tax law has done the opposite. By 2027, according to the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, the richest 1% will have received 83% of the tax cut, and the richest 1/10 of 1%, 60% of it. But more than half of all Americans, 53%, will pay more in taxes. As Trump told his wealthy friends at Mar-a-Lago just days after the tax bill became law, you all just got a lot richer. Number 2, he promised that the average family would see a $4,000 pay raise because of the tax law. You bought it. But real wages for most Americans are lower today than they were before the tax law went into effect. Number 3, he promised to close
Special interest loopholes that have been so good for Wall Street investors, but unfair to American workers.
especially the notorious carried interest loophole for private equity, hedge fund, and real estate partners. You bought it, but the new tax law kept the carried interest loophole. Number 4, he promised to bring an end to Kim Jong-un's nuclear program. You bought it. Kim Jong-un hasn't denuclearized. Number 5, he told you he'd repeal Obamacare and replace it with something beautiful, including insurance for everybody. You bought it. But he didn't repeal and he didn't replace, which is just as well. His plan would have knocked at least 24 million Americans off health insurance, including many of you. Instead, he's doing what he can to cut it back and replace it with nothing. According to the Commonwealth Fund, about 4 million Americans have lost health insurance in the last 2 years. Number 6, he told you,
I'm not going to cut Social Security like every other Republican, and I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid.
You bought it, but now he's planning such cuts in order to deal with the ballooning deficits created in part by the new tax law for corporations and the rich. Number 7, he promised to protect anyone with pre-existing conditions. You bought it. But in June, his Justice Department told a federal court it would no longer defend provisions of Obamacare that protect patients with pre-existing conditions. Attorney General Jeff Sessions said the decision was made with Trump's approval. Number 8, he said he'd build a wall across the southern border. You believed him, but there's no wall. Number 9, he told you he'd invest $1 trillion in our nation's crumbling infrastructure. You bought it. But after his giant tax cut for corporations and millionaires, there's no money left for infrastructure. Number 10, he said he'd drain the Washington swamp.
We are going to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
You bought it. But he's brought into his administration more billionaires, CEOs, and Wall Street moguls than any administration in history to make laws that will enrich their businesses, and he's filled departments and agencies with former lobbyists, lawyers, and consultants who are crafting new policies for the same industries they recently worked for. Number 11, he promised to reinstitute a 5-year ban on all executive branch officials lobbying the government after they leave government. You bought it, but the 5-year ban he signed applies only to lobbying one's former agency, not the government as a whole. And it doesn't stop former officials from becoming lobbyists. Number 12, he said he'd use his business experience to whip the White House into shape. You bought it. But he's created the most dysfunctional, backstabbing White House in modern history and has already fired and replaced so many assistants that people there barely know who's in charge of what. Number 13, he told you he'd bring down drug prices by negotiating like crazy with drug companies.
We are going to get drug prices, prescription drug prices, way down.
You bought it. He hasn't. Number 14, he told you he'd stop foreign lobbyists from raising money for American elections. You bought it, but foreign lobbyists are still raising money for American elections. Number 15, he promised 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit.
We can provide 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit.
You bought it. But the giant tax cut for corporations and the rich doesn't leave any money for this. Number 16, he said he'd create tax-free dependent care savings accounts for younger and elderly dependents and have the government match contributions low-income families put into their savings accounts. You bought it. He's done neither. Number 17, he said that on day one, he'd labeled China a currency manipulator.
We are going to label China a currency manipulator.
You bought it. But then he declared China is not a currency manipulator. Number 18, he said he won't bomb Syria. You bought it. Then he bombed Syria. Number 19, after pulling out of the Paris Accord, he said he'd negotiate a better deal on the environment. You bought it. There have been no negotiations. Number 20, he promised that the many women who accused him of sexual misconduct will, in his words, be sued after the election is over.
All of these liars will be sued after the election is over.
You bought it. He hasn't sued them, presumably because he doesn't want the truth to come out. Number 21, he said he would not be a president who took vacations and criticized Barack Obama for taking too many.
I promise you, I will not be taking very long vacations if I take them at all. There's no time for vacation.
You bought it. Since becoming president, he spent a quarter of his days at one of his golf properties. Number 22, Trump vowed to push colleges to cut the skyrocketing costs of tuition. You believed him, but he hasn't. Instead, he's made it easier for for-profit colleges to defraud students. Number 23, he said he'd force companies to keep jobs in America and that there would be consequences for companies that ship jobs abroad, especially government contractors.
Companies are not going to leave the United States anymore without consequences.
You believed him. But never before in U.S. history have federal contractors sent so many jobs overseas. There have been no consequences. Number 24, he promised to end DACA. You bought it. And then in January 2018, he promised that DACA recipients should not be concerned. We're going to solve the problem, he said. And then he reversed himself again and vowed to end the program by March 2018. Currently, the federal courts have stayed any action on it. Number 25, he promised to revive the struggling coal industry and bring back lost coal mining jobs. You bought it. But coal is still losing customers as utilities turn to natural gas and renewable power. Number 26, he promised to protect American steel jobs.
We will put new American steel into the spine of our country.
You bought it. His tariffs on steel have protected some steel jobs, but industries that use steel, like automakers and construction, now have to pay more for the steel they use, with the result that their jobs are threatened. The trade partnership projects that 400,000 jobs will be lost among steel and aluminum users. Number 27, he said he'd make America safer. You believed him. But mass shootings keep rising, and Trump has failed to pass effective gun control legislation. After 17 died in Parkland, Florida, he promised immediate action on gun safety in schools, but has done nothing. 28, he promised to make 2- and 4-year colleges more affordable. You bought it. But Trump's most recent budget contains deep cuts in aid for low-income and first-generation college students, reduces federal work study, and eliminates the 50-year-old Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant Program, which goes to more than 1 million poor college kids each year. Number 29, he promised to eliminate the federal deficit and bring down the debt. You bought it. Yet, due to his massive tax cut, mostly for corporations and the rich, and his military spending, the deficit is set to rise to $1 trillion, and the debt has ballooned to more than $21 trillion. Number 30, he said he'd release his taxes.
I'm under a routine audit, and it'll be released, and as soon as the audit's finished, it'll be released.
You bought it. He still hasn't released his taxes. America has had its share of crooks. Warren G. Harding, Richard Nixon, bigots, Andrew Jackson, James Buchanan, and incompetence, Andrew Johnson, George W. Bush. But never before Donald Trump have we had a president who combined all these nefarious qualities. America's great good fortune was to begin with the opposite, a superb moral leader. By June of 1775, when Congress appointed George Washington to command the nation's army, he had already become a moral rallying post, as his biographer Douglas Southall Freeman described him. He was the embodiment of the purpose, the patience, and the determination necessary for the triumph of the revolutionary cause. Washington won the war and then led the fledgling nation by directness, by deference, and by manifest dedication to duty. A president's most fundamental legal and moral responsibility is to uphold and protect our system of government. Donald Trump has degraded that system. When he threatens to loosen federal libel laws so he can sue news organizations that are critical of him and revoke licenses of networks critical of him.
We can sue them and win lots of money.
He isn't just bullying the media, he's threatening the constitutionally guaranteed freedom and integrity of the press. When he equated neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan members with counter-demonstrators in Charlottesville, Virginia, by blaming both sides for the violence, he wasn't being neutral. He was condoning white supremacists, thereby undermining the Constitution's guarantee of equal rights. When he pardoned Joe Arpaio, the former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, for a criminal contempt conviction, he wasn't just signaling it's okay for the police to engage in violations of civil rights. He was also subverting the rule of law by impairing the judiciary's power to force public officials to abide by court decisions. When he criticized NFL players for kneeling during the national anthem,
That's a total disrespect of everything that we stand for.
he wasn't just demanding they demonstrate their patriotism. He was disrespecting their, and indirectly everyone's, freedom of speech. When he berates the intelligence agencies and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he isn't just questioning their competence.
Well, it's a shame what's happened with the FBI.
He's suggesting they're engaged in a giant conspiracy to remove him from office, potentially inviting his most ardent supporters to engage in a new civil war. When he boasts that he made up information in a meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada, he isn't just undermining his own credibility, he's undermining the credibility of the United States in the eyes of the world. Donald Trump is degrading the core institutions and values of our democracy. But America is fighting back. In Alabama, voters turned out in droves to elect a Democrat to the Senate for the first time in 25 years. In Pennsylvania, Republicans lost control of a congressional district that went for Trump by nearly 20 percentage points. Since Trump took office, Democrats have flipped 39 Republican-held state legislative seats. The 2018 midterm elections are approaching. It's up to all of us to keep up the momentum. In the face of the worst president in history, we are at our best when striving to strengthen our democracy. We need to talk about Mitch McConnell's do-nothing Republicans. Led by the self-proclaimed Grim Reaper, the Republican-controlled Senate has refused to take up nearly 400 bills passed by the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives. Here are just some of the bills dying in McConnell's legislative graveyard. House Democrats' first major legislative package, the For the People Act, has been languishing on McConnell's desk since March 2019. The bill tackles a host of corrupting influences in our democracy. It aims to reform campaign finance laws to curb the influence of big money, strengthen ethics laws for federal officials, and bolster voting rights by enacting automatic voter registration and ending partisan gerrymandering. Before the bill even passed the House, McConnell declared he would not take it up in the Senate, decrying it as a
power grab that's smelling more and more like exactly what it is.
It is a power grab. It grabs power back for the people. But McConnell is the one grabbing power away from the majority of voters who elected members of the House to tackle real issues. Here's another. The Bipartisan Background Checks Act has been wasting away in McConnell's graveyard for almost a year now. It tightens background checks on all gun sales, including private firearm purchases, online purchases, and purchases made at gun shows. McConnell also pronounced this bill dead on arrival in the Senate. Since passed in the House in February 2019, there were 371 more mass shootings that year alone. Mitch McConnell and his spineless Republican colleagues are too afraid to stand up to their NRA backers, and it's costing Americans their lives. This is in spite of the measures having support of a vast majority of the American public. A third item in the McConnell graveyard, House Democrats passed the Raise the Wage Act, which would lift the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, phasing in increases over 7 years. This would raise the pay of 27 million Americans and lift 1.3 million households out of poverty. But as soon as the bill was passed, Mitch McConnell took to Fox News to declare,
"We're not going to be doing that in the Senate,"
claiming that raising the minimum wage would hurt jobs and businesses. Mitch McConnell and his gang of do-nothing Republican senators have also blocked legislation on climate change, the DREAM Act, net neutrality, protections for the LGBTQIA community, tribal sovereignty, and election security. The list goes on and on. Even the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act is stalled in the Senate. They do all this without even a debate. Remember how you learned in school that one house passes legislation and the other considers it?
Yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
McConnell is throwing those civics lessons out the window. So what is McConnell really doing in the Senate? Ramming through a spate of unqualified, hyper-partisan judges who will shape the courts for decades to come. Trump has so far installed 187 judges to lifetime positions on the federal bench, many with fringe extremist views. 1 in 4 Court of Appeals judges are now Trump appointees, and he's showing no signs of slowing down. Who's the architect behind this full-blown takeover of the judiciary system? Mitch McConnell, of course. Let's not forget that it's thanks to McConnell that Trump was able to install 2 Supreme Court justices. McConnell single-handedly blocked Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, in 2016.
This is the greatest honor of my life.
Refusing even to hold a confirmation hearing for him and keeping the seat open until Donald Trump took office. McConnell and Senate Republicans then invoked the nuclear option, requiring only a simple majority to confirm Supreme Court justices, and steamrolling the Democrats. Even before Democrats gained control of the House and began passing hundreds of bills to benefit the American people, congressional Republicans' only significant achievement was a massive tax cut for the wealthy and corporations. Despite all their claims, their tax cut has not spurred the growth it promised. It's added to the national debt. Business investment is contracting, manufacturing is shrinking, and wages are barely rising. As usual, nothing has trickled down. The only winners are people who are already winners. Everyone else has been shafted. But none of that matters to McConnell and his do-nothing Republicans as long as Trump and the party's billionaire donors and corporate backers stay happy. Oh, and McConnell's do-nothing Senate Republicans refuse to hold a fair and impartial impeachment trial for Trump. McConnell, who's supposed to act in the role of impartial jury foreman for the Senate, said,
Everything I do during this, I'm coordinating with White House counsel.
While Trump continues to break the law and seize power from Congress, the Senate refuses to serve as a check on his power. America used to have a Senate that served the people. But under Mitch McConnell's leadership, what was once the world's greatest deliberative body has become a partisan circus. He and his Republican colleagues have done nothing to benefit the American people, ignoring the voices of their constituents to serve the will of Donald Trump and Republican fat cats. History will not be kind to them. Hopefully, come November, American voters won't either.